It was one of those crisp March mornings in rural Montana where the air smelled like pine and possibility. Jack Turner, a single dad in his mid-30s, stood in front of an old abandoned farmhouse that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and weeds claimed what used to be a front yard. But to Jack, it wasn't just an old house, it was a second chance. Life hadn't been easy on him. After losing his wife 3 years ago, he'd been raising his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, on his own. Between double shifts at the auto shop and sleepless nights, he'd promised her that one day, they'd have a real home again, not a tiny apartment with thin walls and noisy neighbors, but a place where she could run barefoot, where laughter could echo through wide open spaces. He found a listing online, abandoned farmhouse for sale, needs work, and something about it tugged at him. It wasn't much, but it was all he could afford. When the realtor handed him the papers, his hands trembled slightly as he signed. It wasn't fear, it was hope. Lily stood beside him, holding his calloused hand, her wide eyes fixed on the house. "It's kinda broken, Daddy," she said softly. Jack knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," he said with a faint smile, "but so were we for a while. We'll fix it, together." 3 weeks later, Jack's old pickup rumbled down the long gravel road that led back to the farmhouse. The snow had melted, leaving muddy tracks and the faint scent of spring in the air. He'd been counting the days. Finally, it was time to start fixing the place. He had a toolbox in the back, a thermos of coffee, and enough determination to rebuild what life had torn down. But as he rounded the final bend, something made him press hard on the brakes. Thin gray smoke curled lazily from the chimney. His brow furrowed. He hadn't been there since signing the papers. No one was supposed to be. For a moment, he just sat there, engine running, heart thudding against his chest. "Maybe some kids broke in," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight and stepping out. The wind bit against his jacket as he crept up the porch. The door, which he had locked weeks ago, was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning like a warning. Inside, the air was warm, and faint light flickered from a small fire burning in the hearth. Then he saw them. 2 women, one in her late 30s and the other barely 16, sat huddled near the flames. Their clothes were worn, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The older woman froze when she saw him, pulling the younger girl protectively close. "I'm sorry," she blurted out. "We didn't mean to trespass, we just needed somewhere to stay for a few nights." For a long moment, no one spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound filling the room. Jack stood in the doorway, fists clenched at his sides, torn between anger and confusion. "You can't just move into someone else's house," he said, his voice steady but sharp. The older woman swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Please, sir, I'm Sarah, and this is my daughter, Emily. We had nowhere else to go." She glanced toward the floor. "We left home after my husband, after things got bad." Her voice trembled, and Jack could see the bruises she tried to hide beneath her sleeves. Emily clung to her mother, eyes red from crying. They didn't look like thieves or squatters, they looked broken. He took a slow breath, looking around at the small changes in the room. Someone had swept the floor. A few cans of soup sat neatly on the counter. They hadn't destroyed anything, they'd tried to make it livable. Just then, the screen door creaked, and Lily's voice came from outside. "Daddy, are you okay?" She peeked in, her small face full of curiosity. When she saw the 2 strangers, she tilted her head and whispered, "They look cold." Jack looked at his daughter, the innocence in her eyes, the compassion that hadn't yet been hardened by the world. Something in him cracked. He remembered sleeping in his old truck with Lily wrapped in a blanket when they had nowhere to go. He exhaled, long and deep. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay, just until you figure things out." Days turned into weeks, and what started as an uneasy arrangement slowly grew into something unexpected. Jack, Sarah, Emily, and little Lily found themselves falling into a quiet rhythm of life. Mornings began with coffee brewing on the old wood stove, and the sound of hammers and laughter replaced the silence that once haunted the farmhouse. Jack showed Emily how to hold a paintbrush properly, and she surprised everyone with her steady hands and bright ideas for colors. Sarah, who used to be a schoolteacher before life turned upside down, helped Lily with her reading every evening on the porch. The house, once cold and empty, started to feel alive again, filled with voices, hope, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. The townspeople started to notice. One Saturday, Jack's neighbor, Mr. Harper, drove up with a truckload of old lumber and tools. "Figured you could use a hand," he said with a grin. Soon, more folks came, bringing paint cans, garden seeds, and warm meals. What had begun as a broken-down property was turning into a community project. Jack often stood outside at sunset, watching Lily chase Emily around the yard, Sarah laughing as she hung clothes on the line. He realized that the farmhouse wasn't just being repaired, he was being repaired too. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. One evening, as they all sat around the table eating Sarah's homemade stew, Lily looked up and said, "Daddy, this feels like family." Jack met Sarah's eyes across the table and smiled softly. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm. "Maybe that's exactly what it is." By the time summer rolled around, the farmhouse looked nothing like the place Jack had first bought. The porch had been rebuilt, the walls were painted a soft cream, and sunflowers lined the fence that Lily and Emily had planted together. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and apple pie cooling by the window. What was once broken now stood strong, not just the house, but the people inside it. On a golden evening, the four of them sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the rolling hills. Fireflies began to dance over the field, and the gentle sound of crickets filled the air. Jack leaned back in his chair, a peaceful smile on his face. "Can't believe how far we've come," he said softly. Sarah nodded, her eyes glimmering in the fading light. "This house saved us," she whispered. Jack chuckled. "Maybe we all saved each other." Lily, curled up beside him, rested her head on his shoulder. "Daddy," she said, "I like our family now. It's bigger." Jack looked at Sarah and Emily, both smiling through tears. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Guess I didn't just buy a farmhouse, I found a family." The moment hung in the air, warm, full, and real. No grand speeches, no perfect endings, just four souls who had rebuilt not just a home, but hope itself. As the first stars appeared above the roof, Jack whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. Life hadn't gone the way he'd planned, but somehow, it had led him exactly where he was meant to be.